She crouched behind the shattered hull of what had once been a battle vehicle, her chest heaving and her limbs trembling. The ground beneath her was scorched and littered with debris, each fragment a reminder of the violence she had endured alone. Her species had left her behind, their decision swift and absolute. She had been trained for combat, tested in simulations and real encounters alike, yet the coldness of abandonment cut deeper than any weapon. Every instinct screamed to flee, to vanish into the shadows, but there was nowhere to run, and the enemies were closing in. She could hear the rhythmic crunch of their boots against the dirt, the hum of energy weapons charging, the measured precision of predators confident in their superiority. Her vision blurred as fear mingled with fatigue, but a small spark of determination refused to be extinguished. She would survive or die trying. The battlefield was merciless, a landscape of ruin where survival depended on split-second decisions and a willingness to endure pain without hesitation. She had been trained to trust no one outside her unit, to rely solely on her own skills, and yet she had never anticipated being abandoned entirely. Her comrades had disappeared into the chaos, leaving her exposed to forces she could barely match. Each breath she drew was a reminder of vulnerability, every heartbeat a countdown to the inevitable. She scanned the horizon, weighing every possibility, every angle, every cover that could offer temporary safety. Her mind was sharp despite exhaustion, running scenarios in rapid succession, analyzing movements, predicting attacks and anticipating threats. She had to stay alive. Not for glory, not for honor, but because giving up was no longer an option. Her species valued strength above all else, obedience second, and life only if it served a purpose. Weakness was punished without hesitation, and deviation was eliminated swiftly. She had been considered competent, capable, even exemplary at times, yet when the battle turned against her, when her survival became inconvenient, she was discarded. Alone, she navigated the devastation with a heightened sense of awareness, noting the paths the enemies had taken, the terrain's advantages and pitfalls, and the timing of their patrols. Fear sharpened her senses. Pain honed her focus. And yet, despite the terror that clawed at her, a sliver of hope persisted. Something might intervene. Someone might act where her species had chosen inaction. She moved carefully, each step calculated to avoid detection, each breath measured to mask her presence. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and energy discharge, stinging her nostrils and lungs. The sounds of distant conflict echoed, punctuated by sharp blasts and screams that made her flinch. Her body ached from exhaustion and wounds sustained during earlier skirmishes, but she forced herself to continue. The forest edge ahead offered potential cover, a chance to regroup, a fleeting opportunity to survive. She paused, pressed her back against the twisted metal of a destroyed vehicle, and allowed herself a brief moment to observe. Her enemies were methodical, relentless, confident in their numerical advantage. Every instinct told her she would not last long if she remained exposed. Her thoughts drifted to her training, to the drills designed to instill discipline and cunning, to prepare her for situations far worse than this. And yet, nothing could have prepared her for the absolute certainty of being left alone. She had faced fear before, but fear coupled with abandonment was a different weight entirely. Her body tensed as a shadow passed overhead, a sleek hovercraft gliding silently above the scorched terrain. The enemy was searching systematically, covering every approach, every potential hiding spot. She adjusted her position slightly, pressing herself into the shadows, and allowed a shiver to pass through her without yielding to it. Survival required clarity, and clarity required suppressing panic. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as she inched along the edge of the battlefield, avoiding patrols, ducking behind ruined walls, and scanning for anything that might shift the balance in her favor. She was resourceful, trained to improvise, and yet she had never faced odds this dire alone. Every instinct screamed that hope was folly, that survival was unlikely, yet she clung to it with the tenacity of someone who had nothing left to lose. Her species would consider her failure inevitable. Her body would betray her eventually. And yet, in the deepest recesses of her mind, a single thought persisted. She would fight and she would endure even if she had to do so alone. Her movement became more deliberate as she approached a ridge that overlooked a narrow pass. From this vantage point she could anticipate enemy movements, plan her route, and potentially use the terrain to her advantage. She crouched low, heart racing, eyes scanning every shadow, every glint of metal, every possible indicator of threat. The ridge offered the potential for escape, but only if she could reach it undetected. Her muscles burned with fatigue, yet she forced herself forward, each step deliberate, each breath steady. Survival demanded vigilance, precision, and an unyielding resolve. She had learned to endure pain. She had learned to suppress fear. She had learned to move even when every rational thought screamed to stay hidden. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of her vision, moving with confidence and purpose. At first, she thought it was another enemy, poised to strike, and her muscles coiled in anticipation. But as the figure drew closer, she realized it was not one of her adversaries. The posture, the deliberate movements, the focus, it was something different. Someone who did not merely survive but acted with intent. Her pulse quickened, confusion mixing with cautious hope. Could this be an ally? A human, she thought vaguely, remembering fragments of stories and myths of beings who did not abandon others, who acted not for advantage but for choice, for principle. Her body tensed, ready for either aid or betrayal, but a deep part of her knew that this presence could change everything. The figure approached steadily, scanning the battlefield with an awareness that mirrored her own, yet there was a calm determination she had never encountered among her species. Every instinct she had honed screamed that this human was different. Not only capable, but courageous, willing to enter danger without hesitation, guided by a force beyond fear, beyond self-interest. For the first time in hours, perhaps days, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope, not weak, not dependent, but informed by observation and experience. She had been abandoned, left to fight alone, yet this being had arrived. And with their arrival, a possibility emerged that had been unimaginable until this moment. She might survive, not merely by cunning or endurance, but because someone chose to fight beside her. Her gaze met the approaching human's eyes briefly, and in that instant, understanding passed without words. Action, courage, and choice were evident in every movement. The battlefield, which had seemed insurmountable, no longer felt entirely hopeless. She could still fall, still be wounded, still face impossible odds, but the presence of someone willing to stand with her altered the equation. She had been left to fight alone, and yet she was no longer alone. Survival was possible. Strength was possible. Hope was possible. And in that realization, something within her stirred, a determination deeper than fear, a resolve bolstered by the undeniable proof of human courage. She would fight. She would endure. And for the first time she understood that with an ally like this, even the impossible could be challenged. The human moved closer, deliberate and unhurried, yet every step radiated control and purpose. She observed him carefully, noting the way he scanned the battlefield with a practiced awareness, each motion precise yet unforced. Unlike her species, whose actions often relied on protocol and rigid expectation, he adapted instinctively, reading the environment and calculating risks with intuition that defied conventional logic. She expected hesitation, caution bordering on fear, but saw none. Instead, there was resolve, a quiet, undeniable certainty that he would act despite danger. Something inside her stirred at the realization. This human would not abandon her, would not see her as expendable, would not calculate her life as a variable to be discarded. For the first time since she had been left behind, she felt the possibility of assistance that was not conditional or self-serving. He came to a stop a few meters away, crouched low, and studied the terrain as if it were an open book. His gaze swept the battlefield, registering every shadow, every glint of armor, every potential threat. He did not speak, yet his presence communicated confidence and reassurance. She had learned long ago to read body language, to interpret subtle cues, and in this human she found none of the tension that often preceded betrayal or retreat. Instead, she saw focus, readiness, and an unmistakable sense of purpose. She wanted to retreat, to hide and avoid detection, but a strange sense of certainty anchored her. Survival was possible because he was here, because he had chosen to engage, because he acted with a kind of moral clarity she had never encountered among her own kind. The enemies remained unaware of the shift in balance, advancing methodically through the debris-strewn terrain. They assumed she was alone, predictable, vulnerable. Every expectation they held had been carefully trained into her species, and she had followed it countless times, anticipating reactions and outcomes. Yet now the equation had changed. The human did not behave according to expectation. He defied probability. He crouched behind cover, repositioned, and shifted his weight in a manner that suggested he was preparing to engage, not merely evade. She realized, with a mix of awe and cautious optimism, that this human was capable of turning the tide. She had been abandoned by her own people, left to face overwhelming odds alone, yet here stood an ally whose presence itself redefined possibility. He finally spoke, voice low and steady, conveying intent without unnecessary elaboration. "Stay close," he said, words few but weighted with assurance. She flinched at the sound, unaccustomed to commands that were simultaneously directive and protective. She had been trained to obey only under compulsion, to survive only through self-reliance, yet this human's tone carried no threat, only clarity. There was no expectation beyond the implicit offer. Survival together was possible if she acted with him, if she trusted him. She hesitated, uncertainty flickering in her chest, but the fire in his gaze silenced every doubt. Choice was no longer dictated by abandonment or fear, it was informed by his example. She would act. She would follow. She would survive not because she had to, but because he had demonstrated it was worth fighting. The first encounter with danger confirmed the human's prowess. A pair of alien patrols emerged, moving in synchronized patterns, weapons poised. Every instinct screamed that confrontation would be lethal. Yet the human did not flinch. He shifted, observed, and acted with a precision that drew her eyes in disbelief. He neutralized the initial threat not through brute force, which he lacked in comparison, but through anticipation and cunning. One adversary faltered, confused by the unpredictable movement. Another was delayed by clever manipulation of the terrain. The human's intervention created a gap, a window of opportunity for her to move safely. She followed without hesitation, each step guided by his presence, each decision buoyed by his example. For the first time she realized that survival was not merely endurance or luck. It could be influenced by choice, by ingenuity, by courage. She struggled to comprehend the human's mindset. Her species prized superiority in strength, technological advantage, and hierarchical control. Humans, she was learning, operated differently. They relied not on domination but on adaptability, not on fear but on moral certainty, not on obedience but on deliberate action. He anticipated threats, calculated consequences, and acted decisively, all while maintaining awareness of those around him. It was not instinct alone that guided him, it was intention. The difference was profound. She had been left to fight alone because her species valued her life only in proportion to convenience. He was fighting beside her because he had chosen to. Choice was a power she had never witnessed in practice, and it changed everything. As they moved, she noticed the subtle ways he adapted to her presence. He repositioned to shield her without a word, adjusted his stance to signal safety, and created paths of advantage through the battlefield that she would have overlooked. She began to match his movements, instinctively mirroring his timing and positioning. A partnership was forming, though unspoken and raw, forged not through shared culture but through necessity and trust. Every action reinforced a simple truth: humans do not abandon those in need. Their courage is amplified by intention, and their loyalty can transform desperation into possibility. She had been abandoned, but she was no longer alone, and this revelation strengthened her resolve in ways she had never imagined. The battle intensified as more enemies emerged, yet the human remained composed, reacting with calculated efficiency. She observed him redirect opponents, exploit terrain, and anticipate aggression, all while maintaining a protective perimeter around her. Fear still clawed at her chest, but it was tempered by admiration and trust. The human's actions were not aggressive for the sake of dominance. They were deliberate, guided by strategy and the imperative to protect. She realized that he was demonstrating a principle her species rarely acknowledged. The strength of humans lies not only in survival, but in their willingness to fight for others. Their valor was moral as well as physical, and she had been granted the privilege of witnessing it firsthand. A brief lull in the skirmish allowed her a moment to reflect. Every lesson she had internalized about survival and combat now seemed incomplete. Her people had trained her to rely on self-interest, to obey hierarchy, and to endure through fear, yet this human displayed an entirely different logic. He adapted, he protected, he inspired, and he acted without hesitation or expectation of reward. The realization struck her with clarity: humans redefine strength. Strength is not measured solely by ability to inflict damage or to endure pain, but by courage, ingenuity, and the refusal to abandon those who cannot protect themselves. In this moment she understood that her survival depended not just on his skill, but on the philosophy he embodied. By the time the next wave of enemies approached, she had internalized the rhythm of his strategy. She moved with confidence rather than fear, anticipating threats, adjusting her position, and acting in sync with him. Together they became more than a vulnerable individual and a lone human. They became a coordinated force, leveraging human ingenuity and alien adaptability. Every encounter reinforced the lesson she had learned: humans act decisively, morally, and creatively. They fight not because it is required but because it is chosen, and that choice carries a power far beyond conventional measures. She had been left to fight alone, and yet the presence of a human beside her transformed her despair into strength. They moved as one, instinctively synchronizing their steps, their focus shifting from mere survival to deliberate action. She watched him in awe, noting how he assessed threats, exploited terrain, and maintained a protective posture without slowing his own advance. Each decision was precise, each movement calculated yet fluid, blending awareness with intuition in a way she had never witnessed before. She realized she was no longer reacting blindly, she was learning, adapting, and responding in rhythm with him. Where she had once been isolated and reactive, now she was empowered by partnership. His presence was not just a shield, it was a catalyst, transforming her fear into clarity and her desperation into resolve. The enemies were relentless, moving in unpredictable patterns, yet the human anticipated and countered with remarkable efficiency. He redirected attacks, leveraged the environment, and neutralized threats with subtlety rather than brute force. She observed how he communicated without words, through stance, movement, and timing. She began to mirror him instinctively, matching his pace, following his cues, and feeling the rhythm of battle as if it were a shared language. Every interaction reinforced her understanding that humans act not only with courage but with deliberate thought. This was not instinct alone, this was morality in motion, a conscious decision to protect and endure, and she felt the weight and power of it with every heartbeat. Her own confidence grew as she realized the impact of their combined effort. Alone, she had been vulnerable, her choices limited by fatigue and fear. With him beside her, she discovered new possibilities, paths she had not noticed, angles of attack she had dismissed, strategies she could implement without hesitation. He did not dominate or command. He guided subtly, empowering her to act and reinforcing her instincts rather than suppressing them. She was learning from him, yes, but more importantly, she was learning to trust her own capacity to act in ways she had never been allowed to before. Trust was no longer fragile. It was a weapon sharpened by shared experience and mutual reliance. The battlefield demanded constant adaptation. Enemies advanced in waves, testing their coordination and stamina. The human moved with a precision that defied expectation, but it was not just skill that set him apart, it was his willingness to endure risk for the sake of another. He positioned himself to draw fire away from her, intercepted attacks she had not even anticipated, and made split-second decisions that saved them both repeatedly. She realized that humans do not simply react to circumstances, they shape them. Every action he took demonstrated an extraordinary combination of courage, calculation, and moral clarity. He had chosen to act, and that choice altered the flow of the entire encounter. She had never seen this kind of determination in her own species. Her people valued obedience, efficiency, and power, yet when faced with overwhelming odds, they often abandoned those who could not keep pace. Humans, she now understood, were different. They chose loyalty over convenience, courage over calculation of personal safety, and moral clarity over protocol. Watching him operate in real time, she felt an awakening of respect and understanding. She was no longer simply surviving, she was learning to fight with purpose, guided by a principle far stronger than instinct or fear. Humans fight not because they are compelled, but because they recognize that action itself defines what is right. Her role evolved as she adapted to the human's methods. She anticipated enemy movements more quickly, executed maneuvers with newfound confidence, and leveraged his presence to maximize her own effectiveness. She realized that she was no longer merely a survivor, she was an active participant, contributing to a force greater than herself. Each encounter reinforced her understanding of human ingenuity, the ability to improvise, to turn disadvantage into opportunity, and to act decisively while maintaining a protective intent. Her species had taught her obedience and endurance. He was teaching her agency, strategy, and moral courage. The combination was transforming her, reshaping not only her skills but her perception of what it meant to fight and survive. The enemies pressed harder, but they were met with a coordination they could not predict. She observed how the human adapted to every shift, every attack, every pattern of aggression. He communicated in silence, through positioning and timing, and she responded instinctively. Their combined presence became more than the sum of their abilities. It became a force defined by ingenuity, trust, and shared purpose. She realized that her previous understanding of strength had been narrow, limited to physical prowess or technological superiority. Humans demonstrated that true strength lay in choice, in courage, in the ability to act decisively and selflessly under pressure. She had been left to fight alone, Yet now she understood the extraordinary impact of fighting with someone who chose to protect her. Every move reinforced the lesson she had been learning since his arrival. Humans elevate others through action. They do not merely survive, they enable survival, inspire courage, and redefine possibility. She felt the profound difference in mindset. Where her people measured worth by obedience, efficiency, or results, humans measured it by principle, by willingness to act, by recognition of the inherent value in life itself. She felt herself growing stronger not only in skill but in understanding. Survival was no longer the solitary struggle she had known. It was a collaborative force, amplified by his presence, and shaped by choices guided by conscience and courage. The rhythm of their cooperation became almost seamless. She anticipated his moves before he made them, he guided her subtly, and together they countered the relentless assaults of the enemy. She had never experienced this level of synergy, this clarity, this sense of shared purpose. Fear was still present, but it was tempered by confidence and understanding. She realized she had begun to trust not only him but herself, because his example had revealed a new way to act, to survive, and to fight. Humans did not simply react. They chose, they guided, they protected, and through that choice they amplified the efforts of those around them. She was witnessing a principle, not just a skill, and it changed everything. By the time they reached a temporary pause in the conflict, exhaustion was evident in both of them, yet there was no hesitation, no sense of surrender. Every encounter, every maneuver, every act of protection and guidance had reinforced an immutable truth. Humans do not abandon others. They act decisively, morally, and creatively, even against overwhelming odds. She understood that she had been left to fight alone not because she was weak, but because her people had failed to see what humans could offer. And now, standing beside one, she realized that survival, courage, and moral clarity were not bound to species or strength. They were bound to choice, and the human had chosen to fight beside her. In that moment, she allowed herself to feel something she had not in a long time: trust without hesitation, courage without fear, and hope without reservation. The human had transformed the battlefield into more than a test of endurance. It had become a lesson in possibility. She had been abandoned, left to face impossible odds, and yet his presence had illuminated a new path. She would continue to fight, not out of desperation but with purpose, because she now understood what it meant to be supported by a being who chose to act, who chose to protect, who chose courage over convenience. She was no longer alone, and that realization was as powerful as any weapon or tactic she had ever known. The battlefield became a maelstrom of motion, shadows and energy flares intertwining as the enemy regrouped for a decisive assault. Their numbers were greater than anything she had faced alone, their coordination sharp and merciless. Yet the human beside her moved with a precision that seemed to anticipate each move before it was made. He shifted, adapted, and countered, not with raw strength alone, but with strategy, timing, and a remarkable understanding of both terrain and psychology. She followed his lead instinctively, recognizing that survival was no longer about endurance, but about synergy, trust, and seizing the initiative even against overwhelming odds. Each wave of attackers forced them to adapt rapidly. The human's mind was a calculation engine, yet his decisions carried a moral clarity she could not ignore. He did not sacrifice her safety for expedience, nor did he act recklessly to gain advantage. Every maneuver protected her as much as it served to disable their opponents. She had never seen such a blend of tactical brilliance and ethical determination. With each encounter, she understood that humans redefine courage, not simply by surviving danger, but by choosing to confront it in a way that elevates those around them. His choices were deliberate, unhesitating, and astonishingly effective, and she felt her own skill and confidence magnify under his guidance. The enemy adjusted quickly, realizing they could not rely on predictable tactics. They pressed harder, employing greater firepower, and attempted to surround them. The human responded without hesitation, moving to intercept threats, exploiting gaps, and forcing the attackers to overextend. She followed his cues, covering angles he could not while trusting him to cover hers. The rhythm of battle was now a partnership, seamless in its execution, yet every step required vigilance, ingenuity, and courage. She realized that alone she might have faltered, overwhelmed by numbers and fatigue, but with him beside her, even the impossible became manageable. There was a moment when a particularly dangerous opponent emerged, faster and more brutal than the others. She froze for a fraction of a second, and he was immediately there, intercepting the threat with fluid precision. He acted not because it was necessary for his survival, but because he had chosen to protect her. That distinction struck her with profound clarity. Her species might have calculated risk, ranked value, and discarded the inconvenient, yet humans acted with principle and intention. Their courage was not an instinctual reaction, it was a conscious choice that redefined the battlefield itself. And that choice gave her strength, bolstered her resolve, and reminded her that she was no longer abandoned. As they moved through the chaos, she began to notice subtleties she had overlooked. He anticipated the enemy's coordination, forced errors, and exploited hesitation with a calm efficiency that bordered on intuition. Each victory was not flashy, not dramatic, but precise, measured, and effective. It was the hallmark of someone who had faced impossible odds and chosen to endure, not for glory but for the sake of protecting others. The realization settled in her mind like steel. Humans thrive in danger not because they are fearless, but because they choose to act decisively when others falter. That choice, more than any weapon or strength, determined the outcome. The enemies were relentless, yet every advance they made was countered by a combination of human foresight and alien agility. She found herself moving in ways she had never considered, improvising maneuvers based on his subtle cues, and reacting with a clarity born of trust. He was more than a partner. He was a guide, demonstrating by action that courage, intelligence, and principle could overcome even overwhelming adversity. She began to see the battlefield differently, not as a space of fear and abandonment, but as a landscape where possibility existed if one chose to act with determination and moral clarity. The difference was transformative. An ambush forced them into a narrow pass, where the enemy hoped to exploit numerical superiority. She felt the familiar tension of being cornered, yet the human's presence was a constant reminder that strategy outweighed sheer force. He positioned himself to shield her, guided her movements, and anticipated threats she had not even perceived. Every calculated risk he took was grounded in intent, to protect, to endure, to ensure they survived together. She realized that survival was no longer a solitary struggle but a shared effort amplified by human ingenuity and courage. Alone, she might have been overpowered, but with him beside her, every challenge became surmountable. The pace of combat left little room for hesitation. The human's adaptability was remarkable. He shifted between offensive and defensive measures effortlessly, exploiting weaknesses and creating opportunities that others could not anticipate. She followed, learned, and acted in response, her confidence growing with each encounter. Every motion reinforced the lesson she had been learning. Humans do not simply react. They anticipate, adapt, and choose action based on principle. That principle was courage in its purest form, coupled with an unwavering commitment to protect those who could not protect themselves. She had been abandoned, yet this presence transformed fear into possibility, vulnerability into strength. The enemy launched their final assault, pouring fire and energy into a coordinated attack meant to overwhelm them. Yet the human did not flinch. He assessed, adjusted, and countered with remarkable efficiency, turning the enemy's strength into their weakness. She mirrored his focus, acting with precision, and for the first time she felt the exhilaration of fighting not alone, but as part of a force defined by trust, strategy, and courage. Every movement, every decision, every act of protection demonstrated that humans possess a unique combination of resilience, ingenuity, and moral clarity. That realization empowered her to act beyond fear, beyond fatigue, and beyond despair. By the end of the onslaught, the battlefield was littered with the consequences of their choices. They had survived against overwhelming odds, not by chance, but by decisive action, courage, and cooperation. She had been left to fight alone, abandoned by her species, yet here she stood, breathing, intact, and stronger than ever, because someone had chosen to fight beside her. The human's presence had not merely ensured survival, it had taught her the meaning of courage, the power of choice, and the extraordinary nature of humanity. She understood now that true strength was not simply physical or technological, but moral, deliberate, and selfless. Survival was no longer a matter of endurance, it was a matter of choice, action, and the willingness to protect others even when the odds were impossible. Exhausted but unbroken, she realized that this battle had changed her perspective entirely. She had witnessed courage that defied expectation, ingenuity that turned disadvantage into opportunity, and loyalty did not measure value by utility or convenience. They measured it by choice, by action, and by principle. Her survival, her empowerment, and her renewed sense of hope were the direct result of one human who refused to leave her behind. She had been abandoned once, but she would never forget the lesson. Humans fight not just for themselves but for those who matter, and their courage can redefine the impossible.